Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Google Hangout, application toolkit for first-generation law students. My name is Justin Williams. I am the Associate Director of Admissions here at Wayne State University Law School and your host for the evening. I look forward to our chat tonight, and hopefully I answer a lot of the questions you all have about the law school application process. So let's get right into it. What are we going to accomplish this evening? A few big goals I've set for us. One is to demystify the actual application process. What are the things you need to know, and what are the things you totally need to forget? There's lots of misinformation out there about the law school application process, what to expect, how to manage it, how to navigate it. Hopefully we can separate you all from some of those notions and get you on the right track. Dollars and cents. And you'll see I spelled cents a little differently than you may have expected. But it is about being thoughtful about this and using the cents that you have to make some really thoughtful choices about the costs that are associated with the law school application process and paying for law school itself. The next piece we'll cover is the LSAT. I know many of you are wondering have some questions about the LSAT, how to navigate it, how law schools use the information. So we'll talk about it, what's in it, what's on it, and then some broad thoughts about LSAT Prep. Everybody wants to know the easiest way to be prepared for the LSAT. And the reality is that there isn't a magic bullet, but there are things that you can do, steps that you can take to be thoughtful about how you approach the preparation process and what you use. We'll also talk about all of the resources that are out there to you. A challenge specifically for students who identify as first generation is not being aware of all that's out there to really help you navigate this brand new process and make it as easy as you can for yourself. So we'll talk a little bit more about what those things are, right, and some tools you can use to get a better handle on this process and really feel confident taking that step forward. And so we'll start with the law school application process. So what is it that law schools are looking for, right? When they pull up your applicant file and they start to pore over it, what are the things they're trying to accomplish? What are the things that the questions that they're trying to answer? So the first question is relatively straightforward. They're assessing your academic ability and performance with a keen eye towards their level of confidence that if they admit you, that you'll be successful at their institution based on the rigor of the program, the kinds of students they admit, and sort of what they've seen in the past in terms of performance based on the indicators that they use to make those choices. And so what are those indicators? And I think you're all at least somewhat familiar with the items that law schools use to assess that first question and get an answer. So it's your performance on the LSAT. It's also your performance in undergrad, and to a lesser extent, more informative than dispositive, right, is the quality of your letters of recommendation. The LSAT itself is a tool that law schools have used for a long time, right, to sort of separate to identify, okay, well, this is the one thing we know everybody has to do. So when we think about GPA and academic performance, grades, institutions, there's a lot of variables, right, that can influence what a GPA actually means. But the LSAT is a common denominator, as it was, that law schools have developed a certain level of comfort with, and also have a lot of reams of data that give them an insight into what students who perform on the LSAT at a certain level can do in their program. So they'll continue to use these indicators to make that choice. There are some schools that are now accepting the GRE. There's less data out there about the relationship between performance on the GRE and success in law school, but there are some schools that are taking it. So I think that, be thoughtful about that part of the process, have an understanding of what the schools that you want to apply to accept, right? And then make a choice about how you'd like to approach it based on the options you have. And so for that second question, What they're really trying to get to is your personality, accomplishments, your character, and your fit. So when we think about you as an entire person, right, beyond just your academic credentials and your ability in the classroom, what is it that makes you you, right? What's the story behind you? What do you add to our law school and our class that we believe is worth extending you an offer of admission and providing you an opportunity to study at our institution? And so how do we sort through those things? It's the factors that you would think would be used. It's those soft factor items. So the personal statement, the big scary thing that many students are intimidated by, but shouldn't be. It's really just an opportunity for you to tell your story to the law school and help them better understand who you are as an applicant and what you bring to the table. There's your resume, right? So what are the things you've done outside the classroom? What experiences have you had access to? What sorts of extracurriculars and activities have you been involved in? What types of leadership experiences have you had over the course of your career and time away from high school? Letters of recommendation can be informative here too. So if you've got folks who are willing to vouch for you professionally, maybe they aren't professors, or maybe they are professors and they really, really loved who you were as a person, right? That can be a piece that provides some information to the admissions staff and the committee about your fit in their class and what you bring to the table. And then there's also the various addenda that you can submit as a part of this process. Again, those are documents that sort of paint that bigger picture, right? Give us a better understanding of what we're seeing in the application and what it means, right, about who you are as a person. This third question is one that you have little to no influence over, and that is sort of a you versus everybody piece. So you're thinking about the big picture here, right? So every law school has its own set of enrollment goals, what it hopes to achieve in any given cycle. So you're up against that number, right? You're also being judged and sort of viewed as somebody who's a part of a larger applicant pool. So how do you fit into the applicant pool? How do you sort of align with the other folks who are applying to law school in general and the law schools that you're applying to specifically in any given period of time? So let's take a sort of a deeper dive into this application piece. So the elements of an application and the timeline itself. Starting with the elements. So we've talked about these to an extent as it relates to the various pieces, the questions that an admissions committee is trying to get answered, but we're going to talk about them a little bit more individually here. So there's an online application that you have to fill out via LSAC for nearly every law school in the country that you are looking to attend. I know one of the questions that we received was whether or not you had to use LSAC to apply to law schools, and the answer is 99% of the time, yes. LSAC has an iron grip on the process. That's led to some efficiencies for law schools themselves, and even for you all as students. You don't have to manage a bunch of paper applications. You're not mailing in an abundance of applications with a check, right, to cover the fee and all of those different things. So there's a level of ease that comes with that process being managed by LSAC, but you have to go through them to apply to the law schools you'd like to attend. Of course, there's also your personal statement. I guess I'll take a few minutes here to talk a little bit more about that. We did host a similar Q&A style session a few weeks back that talked in depth about the personal statement and how you might want to approach that process and what you can do with it. But I'll take a few minutes to sort of give you all some broader insights here about the personal statement itself, because I think it's worthwhile. The personal statement is an important, essential piece, and it's also sort of complementary, right? So law schools are really using this document to say, well, what is it that I need, that I'm going to learn about this person that I can't get anywhere else in the application itself? Look at it like the opportunity to interview with the admissions committee. Some schools will provide you prompts, right, as to what they'd like you to write about. If that exists, I would encourage you to choose a prompt and write about that. If there isn't a prompt, then I would encourage you to think about, okay, what are the things that this committee has to know about me to make the informed decision about whether or not I'm a fit for their particular law school? I think that that's really a good place for you to start in terms of thinking about how you can frame that conversation. Sometimes students want to talk about the things that have happened to them that are challenging in their lives, that have influenced their decision to go to law school or sort of made them who they are. I think there are really artful ways to do that, right? And that the big picture piece here is that no matter what you write about in your personal statement, you should be honest but positive, right? If something challenging has happened to you, don't bury the punchline, right? Help the committee understand what those challenges meant and who you've become as a result of those things. It's also a piece of professional writing, right? So most law schools have faculty involved in the process somewhere, right? So maybe they're on a committee and they're looking at some of the applications, but not all of them. But this will be their introduction to you as a writer. And committees want to see someone who is capable of high-level writing, because lawyers and law students are professional writers. You're going to spend copious amounts of time both reading and writing in law school. And if your personal statement reflects some deficits in your writing ability that are going to make it hard to overcome in that first year, that could send a signal to the committee that you might not be ready for this. So be thoughtful about that part of the process. If you are still an undergrad, right, or recently graduated and your school has a writing center, go visit that writing center with your personal statement in hand and say, hey, take a look at this and make sure my writing is solid, that it makes sense, that it's clear and coherent, right, that I don't have any sort of grammatical errors or spelling errors or any of those sorts of things that can send a signal to the committee that either you aren't being thoughtful about the process, right, and taking the time to make this a shining piece of writing for yourself, or that you just aren't really in a position as a student to come in here and handle the work that you'll be tasked with at that particular law school. The resume doesn't have to be elaborate. For most people, one page is enough. If you've had a lot of experiences, then you can get into 2 pages. It's important that it's chronological. Don't feel obligated to spend a lot of time with, the bullets on every single thing you've done in every capacity, right? If it's some big picture takeaways, right? So here's the job I did, here's my primary responsibilities, or here's the experiences I've had, right? Just something that lists all of that stuff for the admissions folks to see, so that they can make an assessment on the kinds of experiences you've had and what you might bring to the table as a result. Letters of recommendation. The way that this process works at the law school level is that in your LSAC account, you will be required to submit the information for recommenders. And what happens as a result of that is that those recommenders are then prompted to submit the letters of recommendation directly through LSAC. So you don't have to mail them out or anything of that sort. You just have to know who your recommenders are. What's really important in this process is that when you are sourcing these letters of recommendation, that you are asking very specifically, hey, do you feel comfortable that you can write me a strong letter of recommendation for me to go to law school that's a complement to my application? I've seen students make that prompt and be told from whoever they're asking, I don't know, I don't think I can, right? And that gives you an opportunity to sort of take a step back and say, okay, this person isn't in a good position to do that. So who else can I talk to? Who else can I tap, right? And that's an important opportunity and resource for you to have, is to be able to ask somebody if they can do a strong letter of recommendation for you. Sometimes students will offer their recommender their personal statement, so the recommender can see, okay, this is the picture that this person is painting. This is sort of the theme of the application. How do I write a letter that's complementary to that, right? So you want to think about it that way. If you are someone who is fresh out of undergrad, or I would say 5 years or less, right, away from your undergrad experience, I would encourage you to think about getting at least one of those letters from someone who taught you in a classroom. Law school faculty love to hear from other professors, right, their peers in the teaching profession about who somebody is in a classroom. And so when we talk about that first question about, your academic ability, your acumen, right, your ability to come in and thrive as a student, it can be informative to hear from another professor who you are, how you navigated that space, and what you bring to the table in that regard. So the addenda piece. I get a lot of questions about these because I think students are trying to figure out, how do I explain things, right? How do I best use the addenda? And it sort of exists in multiple buckets, right? I think the first bucket is, okay, is there a thing in your application that may be curious, right? That an admissions committee would look at and say, I'd like to know a little bit more about that, right? And if you can look at your application and say, hey, if I was reading my application, I'd have questions about it, then it might be worth sending in an addendum about it. So there's ones for academic performance. So let's say theoretically, right, you had a semester that wasn't great for you, and something was happening in your life at that time that impacted your ability to be the student that you would normally be. You can submit an addendum that explains that and articulates to the committee exactly what was happening and why that semester is sort of a one-off or not an indicator of who you are and what you're prepared to do as a student. Or sort of in the inverse, right? Let's say you are a phenomenal, you took the LSAT and you blew it out of the water, but for some reason, right, your undergraduate performance wasn't necessarily great, right? Was something happening? Was something going on? Or maybe you just are confident that LSAT score is the stronger indicator and that the school should rely on that. You submit an addendum to explain that. I got a question about, hey, if I was balancing multiple things while I was an undergrad, right, and that, impacted my performance, should I submit an addendum for that? I think that's the other category, right? Is if you're somebody who was a student athlete and you were working and taking care of siblings or, something like that, right? And ultimately you graduated and you were successful. It just wasn't maybe the kind of GPA that you would have had if you didn't have all of those things in your mix. You can submit an addendum that articulates that too. Hey, look, I was managing this, this many responsibilities. If you were somebody who had to work their way through undergrad, you should absolutely be noting on your resume, right? Hey, 40 hours a week, full-time student, right? You should submit an addendum that says, hey, look, I was working 40 hours a week as a student and I graduated and I still managed to be a solid student, maybe not a great student, but a solid one, right? And so that's sort of the place where the addenda can play a role for you and provide that contextual information to an admissions committee. The last piece of the actual physical application is a credential assembly service report, which you purchase the access to the credential assembly service through LSAT, and they, as a result, produce a report for the law schools of your choice, which will include all of your LSAT scores and your performance on that test, all of your transcripts and grades post high school. So if you did a semester at a community college, right, that'll show up in there as you make that request. All of your undergraduate career, if you did a study abroad or anything like that, all of those transcripts will need to be requested and would show up in your credential assembly service report. If you went to graduate school, that will also show up in that credential assembly service report. Now, I do want to make a note too, since we're here talking about this part of the process. When we talk about your GPA as is used typically for law school decision-making purposes, schools rely heavily on your undergraduate record because that is the number that's used. Those are the grades that are used to calculate the GPA that LSAC reports out. So they don't include your graduate school grades in that final calculation of the GPA that's used to make that admission decision. Now, many schools will still take it into account, right? They'll say, hey, look, I believe that you might be closer to the student that you were for the 2 years of this graduate program than you were, 6, 7, 8 years ago when you were an undergraduate student. It's not a sort of a salve over a undergraduate career that wasn't necessarily great, but it can be informative depending on the context, right? To say, okay, this is somebody who's prepared to come in here and do that work. So the graduate level grades can be helpful. They aren't used in the GPA calculation for LSAT purposes, and schools may or may not heavily consider them in that process. I think that's almost a school by school basis. So let's talk timeline, because this is super important and I can't say enough about it. So if you're considering law school and you want to do this, right? One of the bones I have to pick with my first generation students is when they apply. I get students every year who intend to start in August. Oh, I want to start in August. And they come to me in June and say, I'm ready to apply. What do I need to do? Can I start in August if I apply now? And the answer is often probably not, right? We've made almost all of our admissions decisions. The class is largely set. All of the details are all square. And so we don't have as much opportunity. Most law school applications open in the fall, and you would apply typically the calendar year before you'd like to start. Apply early, right? It is highly important that you apply as early as you're ready, because the later you apply, the less room law schools have in their process to extend offers to students who maybe don't fit their academic profile, right? Or maybe it's somebody that you want to take a flyer on who you believe will be a great student, but you just don't have the room in your class, right? So you're managing all of that when you go through this process, which is why it's so important for you to apply as early as possible. I typically tell people to have their applications in before the school's priority scholarship deadline, if you have it, right? And specifically to apply the fall before you want to start. So if you want to start in this fall, next fall 2020, you should be starting your applications now, right? You should be getting that ball rolling because that's the ideal time for you to get the application in. Now, I know there are some of you out there who are saying, well, I can't do that way, right? That's not the way my bank account is set up. And I recognize that. And so it is about, planning, right? If you're at a place where you want to go to law school, you got to start planning ahead, right? Doing this is and saying, okay, next, I want to start tomorrow, right? You have to be thoughtful about this process and make sure that you're planning your steps, that you're organized, and that you're thinking about all of the factors that are going to influence the admissions decision. You don't want to be one of those people in an environment where schools are giving out tons of scholarships who has to pay because they applied late, right? Who could reasonably in any other cycle would be offered some level of scholarship as a result. Again, schools have rolling admissions. So as those applications are coming in, the decisions are being made and the students are being given those offers. So make sure that you're applying as early as you can, make sure you're applying as early as you can. Again, like I said, apply early, right? We're talking about the things that you should consider as you think about the application process and the timeline. I mean, applying early is huge. It's key. I can't say it enough. The earlier you apply, the better your options will be. Own the parts of this that you can control, right? And so what I mean by that is, if you graduated from undergrad, not a whole lot can be done about those grades, right? You can't control that part of the process. What you can control is the quality of writing in your personal statement, right? You can control the strength of your resume and how you sort of frame that out. You control your preparation and for the LSAT, right? And how you're going to manage that process. So own the parts of this that you can control. Be thorough, be thoughtful, and be the best you, right? Continue to be thorough throughout this process. Make sure you aren't submitting a personal statement that's got the wrong school's name in it, right? That you're managing that part of the process. Be thoughtful about when you apply, where you apply, all of these pieces, and make the best case for yourself, because ultimately law schools are interested in admitting whole people, right? You are more than just those numbers. The numbers matter, right? But you are whole people. So you want to make sure that you're making the best case for yourself in this process. Last point on this slide, if you are not a planner, now is the time to get that in gear, right? The best way to survive law school itself is to be in a position to plan, to manage your time effectively. And the law school application process can be a training ground for that. So if you decided that you want to go to law school, you need to take a step back and say, okay, what's my plan going to be? How am I going to accomplish that goal? And hopefully you get from this conversation at least a few pieces that will help you start to frame out the plan itself. So let's move on to the part of this that I think some of you are going to be highly interested in, and it's dollars and cents, right? So how are you going to pay for all of this, right? So let's talk broadly about the application process costs and then some hacks, right, to sort of navigate that process and reduce that financial impact to yourself. So I just came back this week from the LSAC Houston Forum. If you all live in some of these central locales, Chicago, New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Houston, Miami, Atlanta, right? LSAC hosts these huge forums where almost every law school in the country will come to meet and greet and interface with students, right? And one of the questions that I get the most consistently is, how much does it cost to apply to your law school? Which is a great question to ask, because many schools do have law school application fees. It makes me excited because I work for Wayne State and we don't have one. So if any of you are thinking about that and trying to figure out, all right, do I need to ask for a fee waiver, right? You don't need to, because we don't have that application fee, but you should be thinking about that it could cost you money to apply to the law schools that you want to apply to. It's a cost of doing business that you should be aware of. We talked earlier about the credential assembly service and the LSAT. These are things you're going to have to pay for, right? The credential assembly service has a definitive cost, $195 for that. The LSAT to take it is $200. There are lots of costs associated with that. And there's a link here in this slide that will show you what those costs are. So you need to be thoughtful about that. LSAC has done a decent job of putting together some packages where they're bundling all of these things. Those credential assembly service reports that we talked about, it's $45 for each school you want to send those to. So that adds up quickly. You go, 4 or 5 schools, you're looking at almost $300, right? To pay the cost of having them just see your credentials to make that decision. So be aware that that's a cost that you're going to have to incur. And then there's also, once you start getting those excited, happy phone calls where they say, hey, you're admitted and you've got X amount of scholarship dollars, one of the things they're going to ask you to do at some point is put down a seat deposit for the schools that you're interested in, right, to secure your seat in that class. Those can be pricey, right? I've heard schools $1,000, right? So just be thoughtful about that part of the process too, and budget for the seat deposit, because that's not an expense you can get away from. In many cases, that money goes toward your tuition costs, right? So it's not money you're firing out of a cannon into the sun, right? It's going towards the cost of your legal education, but it's still money you'll have to spend out of pocket. So be thoughtful about that, be thinking about that, and try to budget for that as well. So how do you get around these numbers, right? How do you get away from having to pay those application fees to law schools? And that's, pretty easy. It's to request a fee waiver. I say every school, every time, right? Ask every school that you want to apply to every time you apply, if you apply to places multiple times, for a fee waiver. Schools are generally pretty generous, right, about offering those, because they want to encourage you to apply so that they have an opportunity to view your application and make a decision about you as an applicant. A great place to round those up, right, can be at an LSAC forum or to call a school directly, right, and say, hey, do you all offer fee waivers and what do I need to do to get one, right? Sometimes it's as simple as giving them your email address and your name so that they can have you in their system and be able to reach out to you with information. Some schools may ask you to do something else, but you don't know unless you ask, and you should be doing that for every school every single time. We just talked about the cost of the LSAT and the Credential Assembly Service at the LSAC level. The good news is that they also offer fee waivers for those costs. So you should be making that request as well. The great thing about LSAC's fee waiver is all of the things that are included in it, right? So if LSAC grants you the fee waiver, you get 2 free LSATs. One of the LSAT writing portions for free. You'll get a CAS registration and a letter of recommendation service piece that's included in that. So your credential assembly service, and you'll get 6 law school reports. So you'll be able to apply to 6 law schools without having to pay for it. So it's a wonderful, wonderful service that LSAC offers. It can be a little challenging to get it. You have to demonstrate financial need, right? But if you're a first generation student, right, there's a chance that your profile may signal to LSAC that you have financial need and they grant it. And if they don't grant it initially, appeal it, right? I've had people who told me, oh, LSAC didn't grant my fee waiver. What am I going to do? You're going to appeal it and give yourself as many opportunities as you have to make it clear to them that you aren't going to be in a position to apply to the law schools you want to apply to because of the cost, right? So make sure you do that. Apply for that fee waiver, appeal it if you don't get it, and give yourself as many bites at that apple as you possibly can. So big picture stuff, paying for law school itself. So how do most students pay the cost of going to law school? It's typically a combination of scholarship dollars and loan money. Some of that can be federal loans, right? Some of it can be private loans. Federal loans require a FAFSA form, just like an undergrad, right? Typically, law students, you all are seen as independent or professional students, so family income isn't always taken into account. So let's say, your parents have money, but you don't have money, right? It's not the case that you have access to those dollars. It doesn't impact your law school financial aid like maybe it would have an undergrad. You don't even have to necessarily declare that those parents exist. They may not even ask you that in the FAFSA process. An exception to that is for schools that offer need-based aid, right? And there are some law schools out there that will offer you need-based financial aid. So, be conscious of that and be asking about that in your law school application process for the schools you consider is, hey, do you all offer a need-based financial aid regime? If that's the case, they are probably going to want to see what your family income looks like so that they can really determine what your need is and then build a package around that. So like I said, there's merit-based aid versus need-based aid. I think probably 2/3 to 3/4 of schools are probably offering merit-based aid, right? And how that shows up is in scholarships, right? So you'll be based on your profile and other characteristics of your application, be offered potential scholarship dollars that can help offset the cost of your law school experience. And then you make up the rest of that with federal loans. Again, need-based aid, it can be a totally different process, right? In that you'll still go through the FAFSA, but it takes into account every single thing, right? So, the big picture for you about what your actual needs are and then fills in the gaps that way. A thing to think about too, and I don't think all students think about this when they're going through the process, is to consider the cost of living in addition to the cost of tuition, as that will impact the amount of money you'll need to pay for the law school experience. Living in Chicago is more expensive than living in Topeka, Kansas, right? Living in New York is more expensive than living in El Paso, right? So these are all things that you'll need to think about as you go through this process. What is the true cost of me choosing this law school, even if I get scholarship dollars to offset the cost of tuition? I still have to have somewhere to live and all of these things. So be consciously thinking about that part of it as you're making the decision about where you want to go to law school or where you'll choose. Another thing to think about too, as you're taking out the debt that you're taking out to pay for your legal education, there will come a time when you have to pay it back. That's the nature of this beast, right? Is that those loans will eventually come due. And students need to have a better understanding of how much lawyers really make, right? To help them better understand, okay, well, how much money am I actually going to have to be able to repay the debt that I'm incurring in this process, and what kinds of opportunities out there? What does the job market look like? What are people actually making, right? Is new associates and recent law school grads a great resource for you is the National Association of Law Placement, known as NALP. They provide salary distribution data. You'll see a link there to the salary distributions for 2018. What I can tell you is that the mean salary was around 90,000, but about 50% of the salaries for the class of 2018 landed somewhere between $45,000 to $75,000. So it's, the number of jobs out there that are going to pay you that six-figure cushy salary coming right out of law school are much fewer than they were a long time ago. So just be thoughtful about that when you're walking into this. I think many people see a law school opportunity as, sort of, oh, I'm going to be a fan. They think it's what they see on TV, right? People living in really fancy apartments, driving really nice cars, living this really great life. And the reality is that you can make decent money and still never get rich as a lawyer, depending on what you choose to do and the market at the time that you come out. So the more you know about what that looks like, I think the better off you are in terms of making decisions about how much you'd like to take out to support your legal education. Working in law school comes up. I think there are folks who have to do it. And so I don't begrudge them that. I think it can present some challenges, right, in terms of balancing the workload of being a law student with the demands of your job. Some schools offer a part-time evening program. We do here at Wayne, where you'll take fewer courses, and they'll typically be at night after traditional working hours. But be thoughtful about that part of the process. Do not enter into that lightly, because there's a lot of demand in both directions there. And you want to make sure that you are showing up as strongly as you possibly can for each of those things. And if one thing can absolutely suffer, and you have to be thoughtful about that when you do choose to work. All right, so let's talk about the LSAT, the test itself. So here's some basic stuff, big picture pieces. So you register for the LSAT. With LSAT, the exams go into a digital format. The rollout for that began this past July. Some of you probably participated in that little experiment where half of you got the old school written exam and the other half got the newfangled digital exam. This past September was the jumping off point for everybody taking the exam in a digital format. Another new sort of wrinkle is that the writing section is now done separate from the exam itself. So you do that from home. Lots of details about that on LSAC's website. Again, another link that you'll see here. The other piece too, and this is just to reiterate sort of why schools continue to rely on the LSAT as a test, is because of that data that exists about the LSAT score and undergraduate performance being somewhat reliable predictors as it relates to first year law student outcomes. So you'll continue to see schools rely on that because of the predictive value of the test itself. LSAT goes through great lengths to try to make that assessment, and then also adjust the test to continue to keep it relevant. So that is why you'll continue to see law schools rely on that primarily, even if they are accepting the GRE. What's on the test? 5 35-minute sections of multiple choice questions, a reading comprehension section, logical reasoning, some analytical reasoning pieces or logic games as you know them. We just found out recently that those are going to change on future tests. So in about 4 years, LSAC has to do something different with that part of the exam so that it levels the playing field for people of all levels of ability. If you want to know more about what those changes might be, I'd encourage you to stay abreast of LSAC's outcomes, but most of you are probably going to be in law school by the time those changes actually happen. But it's just a cool thing that's happening out there that will change forever the LSAT itself. 4 to 5 sections that you'll take will contribute to your score. Your scores range from 120 to 180. And then, of course, there is that unscored writing sample section as well. So LSAT prep advice. People study differently. I mean, I get this question so often. Well, what do I do to study? What do I do to prepare? And I think there are some real sort of bare bones, base level questions you need to ask yourself to make that assessment and figure out what's best for you. I think the first question is, how do you study best? There are lots of ways to skin this cat. Some people perform really well having just used some books with some practice questions in it because, this just comes naturally to them, right? It makes sense. They understand logic games. Their reading comprehension piece comes to them pretty easily. The analytical reasoning piece comes to them pretty easy, and they do well. Some people prefer to be in that classroom environment, right? So they elect to participate with a private business or one of these private prep companies, right? So the Kaplans, the Princeton Reviews of the world, right, that offer you some classroom opportunities to learn the test and be prepared for it. And then there's also those who say, okay, well, I don't need to be in a classroom. I need that prep support, but I don't need to be in a classroom. I want to be able to log on online on my laptop from the comfort of my own home and do what I need to do to be prepared for the exam. So there's that piece of it as well, right? It's to figure out exactly how you study and then really using that approach to studying to prepare for the LSAT. You also have to think about what your budget is. That's a big piece of this. So when we talk about thinking about costs, LSAT prep is in that matrix, right? You should be thinking about, well, how much money do I have to prepare for the LSAT? I tell people all the time, the money that you use to prepare for the LSAT is an investment in your future. The better you do on the LSAT, the better your chances of being admitted, and the better your chances of scholarship aid as a result. Now, I know everybody isn't able, right? Specifically as first-gen students, you may not have somebody who can help you pay for your LSAT prep. But if you know you want to go to law school and this is what you want to do, you have to be thoughtful. You have to say, okay, well, how can I start putting some money away, right, to put myself in a position to get the best LSAT support that I can to position myself to be successful on the exam itself. And the last piece here is to practice. There's no substitute for practice. You should be taking practice exams. The first time you take an LSAT should not be the first time you take the LSAT, right? You should be taking practice exams, taking diagnostics, drilling yourself on the material, and really measuring your own progress, because you don't know how well you are or aren't doing unless you're testing yourself in those timed testing conditions to really help support that work. All right, so what resources are out there for you all as you go through this process? I think we can start with LSAC, right? LSAC's a tremendous resource. There's a ton of stuff on that website about law school applications, the LSAT, and more, right? So make sure you're registered. Make sure you're exploring that website and really digging into all of the content that they have. There's even a place where you can take a practice digital LSAT so that you can become familiar with the interface, what that looks like, the tools you have within the actual application, right, of the exam that you can use to be prepared for that exam. It's such a wonderful resource. It's familiar.lsac.org is where you can go to take that practice digital LSAT. Again, we talked about NALP too. I think it's important for you to know what the job market looks like, right? If you're walking into this with some preconceived notions about what your outcomes can be and they're overly generous, right, you can hit a bit of a reality check, right? When you get out there and you start looking for jobs and you realize, oh, I'm not going to make $180,000 in my first year. Maybe I'm making 55, right? Maybe I'm making 70. So just get a better understanding of what the job market looks like for lawyers across all of the sectors, both, public and private and various capacities, so that you can walk into this as an informed consumer. Another sort of good resource is accesslex.org. AccessLex used to be known as Access Group. Almost all of their focus was on financial preparedness and repayment for law students, right? Recognizing that there's significant debt that is often incurred in the process for law students trying to pay for this education. And so they've sort of evolved over time to cover a lot of different bases, right? So they're helping students think about access to law school and helping institutions find new ways to create pipeline programs to get students like you all, right, into their institutions and into the pipeline and prepared for the law school experience. So they've got some great resources there. Lots of great info about the application process and considerations, financial preparedness and repayment, and then also identifying the right schools for you. We'll talk about this a little bit more in some upcoming slides, but they just launched a new platform called explorejd.com, which is going to be a great tool as you start to think about the schools you want to apply to and where it might be right for you to attend. So definitely check that out. And then sort of the last big resource are the law schools themselves. I can't say enough about how important it is for you to talk with the folks at the law schools that you're trying to attend to get, make sure you're getting your fee waiver and make sure you understand, deadlines for the applications and what scholarship opportunities might be out there for you to help you better understand once you're admitted, okay, when am I going to have to pay a deposit? How much is that deposit going to be? All of these sorts of details that are going to be important for you in the process. And also, every school is required by the American Bar Association to make certain disclosures available on their website. So as you're thinking about outcomes, right? So you look at that data and say, all right, I understand what the job market is and what jobs might look like for lawyers when I'm coming out of law school. But what does this school do, right? What's their job placement rate, right? What's their bar passage rate? What's their scholarship retention rate? All of this stuff is on every law school's website. So if you go up to their little search box and you type ABA required disclosures or standard 509 disclosures, you should be prompted to a page that lists all of this important information about the law school from a consumer standpoint, right? Sometimes schools call it consumer data, right? So it's so you know what you're buying, right, when you sign up to attend that law school. So I'd encourage every one of you to start there when you're building out your school list, is to get those disclosures and really understand what the value proposition of an individual law school might be. All right. So my grandmother used to say anytime I said something, she'd say, oh, famous last words, right? So these are going to be my famous last words for you all this evening. You can do this. And you will. Some of you are going to get some negative feedback in the process, and people may look at you and say, well, why are you trying to do that? Or what are you trying to accomplish? And the reality is that there's nothing about this process that says that you are incapable of both going to law school and being successful there. So if you want to, then go after this and go after it as hard as you have anything in your life. And I think you'll be satisfied with your outcomes in the long term. So what are some things you can do, right, to really help yourself? I think you got to build your school list, right? Students should be thoughtful about this part of the process. You should have schools on your list that you're pretty confident will admit you based on your academic profile. I won't say no. No will admit you, because I think that can be some touchy territory, but we would call those like safe schools, right? And then there are schools that might admit you based on your academic profile, but you don't know, right? So you look at it and you say, maybe I'm in their 25th percentile, so there's a chance here. And those schools are what we would call maybe like some reach schools. And then you should have one or two dream schools that these are just the schools I want to apply to because I love everything about them. I don't think I've got a snowball's chance, but I'm going to apply, because you never know, right? Every cycle is different. And the folks reviewing your application at Yale, right, if that's where you want to go, might see something in your application that says, yes, this is somebody who we want here who can be successful. So, build an actual list, apply to more than one school, right, and give yourself an opportunity to have some choices in this process. Also, be thoughtful about where you choose to go, and consider the entire scope of this process. When you're making that choice, where do you want to live? What do you want to pay for your legal education? The opportunities the school has for you after you graduate, right? The opportunities that exist inside the school for you to do interesting and cool things, right? The environment, what's the culture like? What's the diversity like in this place? All of these things should fit into the calculus for you in terms of where you'll go, right, and where you'd like to be. And again, just going to plug Explore JD as a resource for you on that front. As it relates to that, sort of the academic profile piece, LSAC also has resources to help you figure out what schools you might be able to get into just based on that academic profile. So from a holistic standpoint, Explore JD has some resources. From a straight up academic standpoint, LSAC has some really great resources for you too. Also, stay away from Reddit. I know some of you out there are Redditors, and you're reading all of that information on Reddit from people about law school and the application process and what they saw, what they've seen, and what people are experiencing. And sometimes that can create some anxiety, that can create some trepidation, that can leave you with more questions than answers. And so try to stay away from it, right? And own the process from your end and do the best you can. Last piece here, apply early, ask questions, and seek every opportunity you can to lessen the burden on paying for the many aspects of this process, because the money matters. It's not the only thing, right? If it's maybe it's not driving the car, but it is helping you navigate, right? So be thoughtful about that part of the process, and seek the help and the relief when you can. So that's the core of the presentation. I know we've got some questions that folks want to get answered, so I'm going to get into some of those. Are there any areas to avoid touching on in a personal statement? And I think we talked about that, right? I think it's less about what you can or cannot touch and more about how you present the story, how you make your case, how you sort of weave to people the narrative. And my advice is to always be positive, help people understand what the takeaway is from this. What's the value add for you? If life was hard, right, then, hey, look, who did you become as a result? How has that informed your decision to choose law school? I also think to that extent, you should probably be thoughtful, right? This isn't to say that you can't touch on issues of politics, religion, and social issues in a personal statement and that you shouldn't touch them, right? But I think you should be conscious of the fact that multiple sets of eyes may see this, and they may not agree with you in your worldview and your understanding. And so sometimes that can show up, right? And somebody saying, this person's, they're smart, but I don't know, right? And that doesn't always show up as, you not necessarily being admitted, but people can remember these things, right? So just be thoughtful about that part of it when you're in the process. That's not to say that you shouldn't talk about a thing, but recognize that in talking about a thing, people may look at that and say, okay, I don't know if I would have made the same choice, right? If talking about this in a personal statement is the right place for it. So just be thoughtful about it in that regard. Next piece here for people who have LSAT scores that aren't the strongest, but decent letters of recommendation and a solid GPA. Do I have any advice for those people? My advice for somebody who doesn't necessarily have a great LSAT score, but has solid letters of recommendation and a solid GPA, is to apply to the law schools you want to go to, and let them decide, right, whether or not you're a good fit for them. I think that the challenge in this process is that you all don't know what we know about what we're trying to achieve, what we hope to accomplish, what our goals are. And there may be room for you at a school that you had never even considered just because you don't believe that your LSAT score is strong enough. So give a school a shot to evaluate you as much as you've evaluated them. I think if you've got decent letters of recommendation, you need to figure out how you can make them be more than that, right? Are there other people you can ask? Is there other information you could give to your recommenders that would move them from decent letters to strong letters of recommendation? And really try to manage that part of the process. The GPA, if that cake is baked, you can't go back, right? So if you graduated, right, there's probably not much chance for you to change the GPA. If you're farther along in your academic career, it becomes a lot harder to move up, right, just by having a good semester. But if you're still in school and your GPA is solid, continue to achieve and continue to push that up as high as you can. So somebody's asking specifically about our Damon J. Keith Scholarship. They were enrolled in a Detroit public school through 6th grade, but didn't graduate from a DPS school. Are they eligible for the scholarship? The answer is yes. If you choose to apply to Wayne, just make sure that there's a question that asks what schools did you go to if they were in Detroit. Just make sure you note the schools you went to, so that verifies for us your eligibility, and we'll go from there. And then this question here says, what is the acceptance rate at Wayne Law? Any given year, you're looking at about a 40 to 45% acceptance rate, right? So a little less than half of the people who apply, we will accept here at Wayne. And then how many letters of recommendation should we be prepared with for the application process? Another great question. Most schools want at least 2. And then they'll have a ceiling, right? So maybe it's 3, maybe it's 4, maybe it's 5. But I think for most schools, 2 is the minimum that you should have, and also a satisfactory number. So you don't have to have more than that, and it doesn't necessarily advantage you in the process to have a lot of letters of recommendation. So I encourage you all, if you have other questions, to enter those in. I know we had a question about the public interest, if we have any sort of scholarships for public interest or public service interested students. Here at Wayne, we do have a public interest law fellowship that promotes opportunities in public interest law, eases some of the financial stresses we've talked about, and then offers some of that assistance to organizations that provide legal services to underserved groups. So if that's something that you are interested in, we do have some opportunities here. Do undergrads have a higher chance of being accepted after a gap year or immediately? Never have I ever, in the conversations I've had on the admissions side, had somebody say, oh, this person took a gap year, we are not taking them, or this person took a gap year, that makes me much more comfortable to admit them. I think it's really about the strength of the application overall. When you apply, what you choose to do with your time is really less important. And then somebody asked specifically about our seat deposit. So ours is typically in 2 parts. So the first deposit is $300, and then the second is $200. So that is our seat deposit information. Do engineers have a better chance of entering the school? They have a better chance. That's an interesting question. Yes, they can enter the school whenever they like to in terms of being admitted. I don't necessarily know if you have a better chance, right? I think when you look at that GPA and your performance in undergrad, there's an eye towards the rigor of the program, the sort of what you've accomplished, the kinds of courses that you've taken, and there's sort of an acceptance, right, that there are some programs and some courses of study that are a little bit more rigorous, right? So we may say, all right, well, that 3.0 in mechanical engineering looks a little different than the 3.6 in basket weaving, right? And so that gives the committees an idea of who you are as a student. But it doesn't necessarily change the chance, right? It is saying, okay, we're looking at you as an entire person, and we're still considering the entire application. We just know that your program had, a different level of rigor than some others. If there's no application fee for Wayne, is there still an LSDAS fee? Yes, so that's a fee that you're going to have to continue to pay. It just doesn't cost you, and you don't pay us anything to apply to us. All right, so what other questions might you all have? I'd encourage you to still enter those in if you have them. I want to make sure I answer as many questions as I can this evening. While we wait on other questions, I'll just briefly introduce you all to us. If you want to stay in touch with us after this, We can be reached here directly in our law school admissions office at 313-577-3937, or you can email us at lawinquirer@wayne.edu. There's our crack team listed there on the right, our Dean of Admissions, Kathy Fox. Of course, there's me, Justin, the Associate Director of Admissions and Diversity Recruitment. Jill Burnett Maurice, my wonderful colleague, our graduate outreach specialist and graduate of Wayne Law, and our seasonal recruiter, who you may see out there on the road if you go to some fairs around the country this year. Her name's Ashley Strauser. She's a 2019 Wayne Law graduate. And our lovely student ambassadors, whose voices will be the first ones you hear if you choose to give us a call, or be the first ones to respond to your email if you shoot us a line. Caitlin, Mandy, Allison, Angela, Sim, Morgan, Reginae, Brianna, Derek, Lauren, Mike, Christina, and Jessica. Great group. You'll love them. So definitely reach out if you would like to learn more about us. Letters of recommendation question: for a mid-career applicant out of school for many years, would 2 letters of recommendation from an undergraduate and graduate advisors be sufficient, or should a 3rd letter from a professional colleague or employer also be included? I think that's a discretionary call, right? If you are in a position to source letters from undergraduate or graduate professors who can write those strong letters, I think that's great. I think you can have that 3rd letter from a professional colleague to support, or an employer, as it were, to support as well. Or you could mix it up, right? You could get 1 letter from somebody who's taught you in a classroom, and then another letter from somebody who knows you professionally. So that's a great opportunity there. And looks like the questions have slowed down here. So I think this might be a good place for us to end our presentation this evening. If you do have other questions, just make sure to send those to us either via email or give us a phone call. And we would love to answer those questions. I invite you to come visit if you want to see the school and take a tour of the building. We'd love to have you. And there'll be future iterations of Google Hangouts or webinars like this, where we'll talk more about the application process and also the personal statement. So please stay tuned. Beyond that, thank you all for joining us, and have a wonderful evening.